Hi, everyone. Welcome to week 10. We're going to be focusing on disasters and going back to something that we've seen before in week 8, remember, the idea of framing and media framing theory. So let's start by reconnecting some of the dots. And this is also ties into something that we did at the beginning of last week, that is reminding you of different ways to approach the way you think about an issue, and keep in mind that the way your final report should be thought of is precisely through these conceptualizations. Last week was the idea of capital for Dio versus Putnam. This week is the idea of media framing and media framing theory. And to recap a little bit, remember that media framing, it's really a very simple concept that theoretically it's I think very easy to understand. The problem comes when you get into the detailed analysis of how a particular type of information is framed. So really, media frame is the selection of information that influence audiences, that is us, on how to think about current issues. So the emphasis here is on the how and not on the what. So it's not what to think. Remember that I told you that has to do with propaganda, what to think. And actually propaganda is much more ineffective. So how to think is media framing is much more effective because it's implicit. And in that implicit way of thinking about an issue is organizing our everyday reality, as we are surrounded by different issues during the news media cycle, right? So this framing reproduce, they not produce, right? So the how here, it's in the reproduction, how to think, and doesn't produce the what, right? So journalists, media journalists, especially I'm thinking television, really, or news media, reproduce these frames that already are resonating in the culture in which these frames are reproduced. So for a frame to be able to reproduce, there has to be already an environment that allows that reproduction. Yeah, and the frame of the main media frame, that media framing that we'll be looking today, is the idea of the causative model. And I'm gonna oppose the causative model of media framing to social sciences constitutive model. And I'll explain what that is in the next slide. Okay, so then we have these two type of framings, one causative that is typically used on the media, and one constitutive that is most commonly used by social sciences. And because in here we're talking about, we're using disasters as an example. When it comes to thinking about these disasters as a social issue, we have two different ways of approaching those disasters. And sometimes these models overlap. So it's not that there is not, the divide is not so black and white, but it's commonly or typically within media commentary, we see the causative, and typically within social scientists commentary, we see the constitutive, right? So the idea is that the problem with the causative, that has to do with the causes, is that when it comes to social issues and social relationships, social issues imply there is some type of new relationship within society. Causation, that is the causative model, it's very hard to point out. It's really hard to see. It can only be approximated. So that's why you can only really, within certain type of social relationships, whether social relationships created by a disaster or by a crisis or by any other type of social issue or social unrest, correlations at most can be inferred. Sometimes you can have a causation, a direct causation, but it's usually it's usually the issue is usually about different type of correlations. However, media communications tend to reproduce a model of causation, right? And this model of causation basically is what is causing that. When you see media commentary, so what is causing that outcome for that crisis? The crisis is explained, for instance, as an earthquake provoked that disaster, but what's causing the social unrest after the disaster, right? That is a causative model. However, the constitutive framing is really looking, it's tasked with understanding what constitutes the factors leading to that crisis. Therefore, it's looking at a much larger timeline. It's usually historical, it's structural, it looks at the different points in history in political economy that constitute the outcome of that particular crisis that was created by a disaster, for instance, in the first place. The problem with this constitutive model, and that's why it's usually adopted by the social sciences, it doesn't really fit in a 2-minute answer in, on television or a column newspaper. It needs a much deeper, sophisticated, nuanced explanation that the way media works today doesn't allow for, right? So you will need to, your task here is to think through how these causative models are constituted within the media space and try to understand that causative model in order to create a constitutive model. What are the different factors that constitutes that particular issue that you're looking at? And that is how you should be approaching, in this case today, disasters, but whenever you think about your own report later down the track about the issue that you are thinking of. Yeah. Okay. So remember that disasters are very useful to look at when it comes to the causative versus the constitutive, because they're always mediatized. So that's it. The media, it's always enter into the space of the disaster. It mediates disaster, and it uses this causative framing. And in that, and in doing that, it treats a disaster as this disrupted event. It's a humanitarian emergency, that it is contingent to that earthquake, to that tsunami, to that crisis. And it implicitly, or sometimes explicitly, asks for this sort of like global, moral, cosmopolitan view of the disaster that requires humanitarian intervention, right? So remember about celebrity philanthropy. It is that kind of requirement, or at least it works within that framework. And it really, it's encoded in this Western cultural imaginary of help, of the need to help, the right. Remember when we were talking about geopolitics and the right to protect? So humanitarian intervention here is it with it, and when it comes to disaster, is encoded within that Western humanitarian, with the Western cultural imaginary of the mission, the moral mission to intervene, the humanitarian right to intervene and to help. However, as Calhoun here points out, and the problem with this is that it's that frame the disaster as something sudden and unpredictable that require immediate actions, right? But as Calhoun here notes, and I quote, many emergencies, and then remember, look at how he's putting this within quote, many emergencies, because these emergencies are not so sudden, not so unpredictable, and they're not so much of an emergency. They develop over long periods of times, are not merely predictable, so you cannot really predict an earthquake, but are watched for weeks or months of years before they break into public consciousness or into agendas of policymakers. So the earthquake is unpredictable, but the response to the earthquake or the aftermath in the earthquake is completely predictable. Not only predictable, is known to be commonplace when in the places where this earthquake or with this disaster happened. So the problem here, what is Calhoun is pointing out, the issue is that by framing these disasters are emergencies in need of Western intervention, for instance, the abnormal, what was an abnormal situation, let's see, for instance, as we will see in later, the enjoyization of Haiti is left unquestioned and refi as normal. And the predictable outcome is framed as unpredictable, right? So therefore, the focus is on the immediate response. And this focus on the immediate response favored status quo. And then the political, ideological, and even moral framework of that status quo is never questioned, is never put into question. Yeah. So in order to unpack that immediacy, that framing disasters as emergencies, then we need to, really, Simon Cottle here uses Naomi Klein's idea of shock. And this is very useful to unpack the causative model, to look at constitutions of factors that intervene when thinking about the disaster and its aftermath. And the shock doctrine thinks, Naomi Klein's book, thinks through how different disasters in contemporary history have served the purpose of shocking us into accepting a new order, a new status quo. And then I quote from Klein here. So the shock doctrine works in this way. The regional disaster, the coup, the terrorist attack, the market meltdown, the war, the tsunami, the hurricane, puts the entire population of a state of collective shock. And not only the entire population of the place where the disaster is happening, but also the population outside the disaster in the West, looking at that place through the eyes of an emergency, through the eyes of the shock. The falling bombs, the burst of terror, the pounding winds serve to soften up whole societies, much as the blurry music and blows in the torture cells soften up prisoners. Like the terrorized prisoner who gives up names of comrades and renounces his faith, shocked societies often give up things they would otherwise fiercely protect, right? So that shock soften us up into accepting that emergency framework. And we accept that in the name of the emergency, certain things are valid. For instance, in here, really Naomi Klein is thinking about the Iraq War and the Patriot Act and the NSA spying program in the US. He's thinking about that, but you can think of many other type of like the securitization of society, for instance, the policing of society, the militarization of society after terrorist attack. That's sort of like the most common framework, right? So those shock, that shocks, that is a constitution. Looking at how societies are shocked, that would be looking at the constitution, not looking for causation. You don't have to look for the causation, but look at the constitution of the shock. Yeah. Moving on, then in order to understand, for instance, how a shock is constituted after a disaster, we need to be able to decode the signs of those disasters. And in here, semiotics are very useful. So I'm going to play a really useful clip on how semiotics work, and how semiotics and Roland Barthes, who was a semiotician, his theory of signs and symbols, how that can help us to read the signs that allow us to decode the constitution of a shock, for instance.
Switch on the TV. What do you see? The breaking news graphic, the scrolling text, the news presenter behind the desk. Read the signs, the hair, the makeup, the suit. What is this story about? The rhythm of the words, numbers, colors. Why are these codes here? The music, the size of the letters. How do you feel? A news bulletin is a selection of signs, the flow of words, read off the autocue, the artifice of the presenter's cadence, the news voice, the gaze looking right at you but through a lens, visual stand-ins for credibility, authority, legitimacy, rhetorical motifs constructing the biggest myth of all, that what we are watching is unmediated reality. This is what Roland Barthes would have seen. The TV screen as a cultural text, and he would have unveiled its myths. Because to read symbols and signs, to interpret them, is the work of a semiotician. In the 1950s, Barthes started writing about popular culture. In his book Mythologies, he gathered multiple discordant subjects: food, horoscopes, religion, advertising, toys, photography, detergents. He saw this as elements of mass culture, imbued with ideology, providing society with the myths that once came from fables and epics. Barthes said, the starting point of these reflections was usually a feeling of impatience at the sight of the naturalness with which newspapers, art, and common sense constantly dress up a reality which is undoubtedly determined by history. Barthes didn't just spotlight the myths that surround us. He put back the curtain on their ideological premises. He warned us against taking all that surrounds us at face value. The fonts in your daily newspaper, they don't just reflect meaning, they add it, they change it. The framing of this shot, what's the history behind it? The selfie, the latest representation of the bourgeois individual. The stick, a seal of authenticity, of status. The subtitle, the voice as text. What could be more, Bart?
The voice as text. Not only the voice as text, television as cultural text, the media as cultural text. The idea that news media present itself as unmediated, as just being a mere vessel of information, while it's actually shaping that information, is framing that information, but that framing is never seen. So when it comes to disasters, this way of approaching media, and that's why your media analysis was so important, is to understand how this framing coming to be, how they're constituted. Bart is looking at ideology, but ideology, it's another way of thinking about, in more neutral terms, about the historical, political, economical aspects that constitute, for instance, in here, a shock, that constitute a framing of a disaster. So I'm going to be looking at really quickly, three different disasters and how they're framed, right? I'm going to start with this idea that social media is one of our new disasters, right? And the idea that social media is a disaster really stems from Marshall McLuhan's phrase of the medium is a message. So now social media, which is a new medium, is it's shaping that medium, is shaping its message. But the problem with this message of social media is that the message in that new medium is society in general. Therefore, that social media not only modifies our social behavior, but is the cause of political division, social unrest, all type of like mental illnesses and anxieties, right? So this idea, the problem with this new disaster is the way it is framed. And because if you think through how this disaster is framed, it really resembles the way the media frames other type of disaster. It is causative, right? Social media causes social unrest. It focuses on the immediate. It looks at how social media is creating all these impacts, all these negative impacts on society, and at the same time is promoting their reification of the status quo. Because if social media is creating all the social unrest, what is implied is that we need to go back to a normal state of media, a normal state of affairs in our society, which is really invited that's nostalgia for the past, implying that there was some type of equilibrium in the past, right? The problem is that this way of looking at social media, it's really forgetting, or is shocking us into forgetting the long-term causes that are creating this social unrest. Think about the GFC, think about the precarization of our economy, or the Uberization of our economy. Think about climate change in action and the consequences for immigration, right? So on and so forth, right? So this very quickly is a way of decoding how social media is thought or is framed as a new disaster. Let's look at another one. Case study 2. I've talked about this multiple times, right? How Haiti became NGOized. And the way Haiti has been framed in this way is framed through different type of emergencies, and it's framed as a model enterprise of the West. We need to intervene in Haiti because, look, every time they have a natural disaster, all these things happens, right? And the problem is that all this is the aftermath of this of this natural disasters. Is completely predictable, but is framed as our duty, as the helper's duty of intervening. However, if we take the example of Leogan, one of what is called the city of NGOs, and here I'm quoting from an article in The Nation that is titled "The NGO Republic of Haiti," we realize that really is the NGOs are causing the problem, the problem in the aftermath of a crisis, right? And here I'm quoting: the relief workers who flooded Leogan, clogging the streets with their SUVs, were often young and idealistic, eager to join the effort to build back better, right? And this is Bill Clinton's initiative. He was the one who started framing the initiative around Haiti, for instance, in the 90s, started in the 90s and later down the track in the early 2000s. But how these NGOs wanted to build Haiti back was often driven more by donor objectives than by the needs of the beneficiaries, as they are called in NGO speak, right? So people, citizens are called beneficiaries, right? The way of like really, it's not so much demeaning, but neutralizing and moralizing and patronizing what Haitians are, which are citizens in the end, right? With agency. Strips of agency. What the people Lebanon needed when their city was destroyed was new, safe housing on dry land. What they got instead were square boxes in the middle of flat plain. You know, this is a very extreme example of how really humanitarian help doesn't work, and Haiti is that kind of extreme example. But underneath it, there is this frame of the Western need to intervene. While that type of the aftermath in that intervention is never looked at, is never scrutinized, it's exempted of responsibility. And of course, the other thing that is out of focus within this frame is the centuries of colonial intervention, but not only colonial intervention in the past, but more contemporary military interventions in Haiti, for instance, neo-colonial interventions when the US supported the coup against Aristide in the 90s, right? So this is our frame out of focus. And when we focus on the emergency and the problems that, that are contextualized and contingent to that particular natural disaster. Finally, I'm going to end with case study 3 was something that we all know here, which I thought it was really interesting how really when I was looking at the news these past years around panic buying when lockdowns were happening, they were panic buying were framed most commonly or practically all the time around these selfish people that were ignorant and didn't know what they're doing, and they were just hoarding toilet paper, right? And while that was untrue, that doesn't mean that those people were selfish, and then this universal we, or the other side of the coin, that there were people who were not doing it and they were intelligent and rational, right? The problem was not really, it was not really about the people buying, but it was about the structures that created that panic buying. And the thing is that supermarkets are structured around limited supply of stock. They're not required. They're not storage facilities. They don't have a storage facility. Their storage facilities are way outside the city and far away from most supermarkets, right? And they're not required to stock produce for long periods of time. They cannot really do it, right? And that's why they can make a profit, because they can get cheaper new produce by getting a constant supply of stock that can replenish constantly and giving you the feeling that you have many options to choose from, right? But they're depending on third parties, that is trucking company. So whenever there is a sudden escalation of demand, they're not equipped to meet such sudden escalation of demand, because they are designed for short-term supply, right? And then I'm going to leave you with British psychologist Clifford Stott, who actually thought through how panic buying was really framed as an irrational event, but it was very much a rational response. And the problem was that the way the media framed panic buying left out the structural causes, for instance, has to do with government policy, not only with the way supermarkets or these corporations are structured for lost stock supply, but larger economic and government policy around the supplying of essential products. So I'll leave you with this, and then I'll explain what we're doing in our discussion.
It makes us think that other people are behaving in selfish ways, which leads us to think, oh, well, we need to go out and get that fuel, because if we don't, they will, and I'll be left without any fuel. So the key point about that is a kind of logic. It's got a logic to it, and it's not really about panic. It's about dependency, that people are buying the fuel because they need it. And they know that if they don't get that fuel, that they are going to be left without it, and therefore they won't be able to go about their normal business, they won't be able to go shopping, they won't be able to go to work, and so on. So it's really important that we understand it as an increase in demand, not a product of panic. It's actually increased level of demand at a time where the supply chains have been weakened through various different factors, one of which is the shortage of HGV drivers, but the other, of course, is Brexit, the other is pandemic, the other is the lack of investment in the industry over decades by successive governments. So those are much more sensible ways in helping us to understand what's causing the problem than blaming each other for why it's happening. And for me, that's kind of what the problem is that it's not about us, it's not about each other, it's actually about failures of governance that we really need to be addressing.
So failures of governance, that's the constitutive model, right, versus the causative model. What is causing low stock and panic buying? People who are hoarding toilet paper, right? That's the causative model. That's the cause. The constitutive model is looking at government policy, at the structure of the economy, how something works structurally, and unearthing the causes, how the factors that constitute that particular moment of crisis, right? Okay, so what I want you to do now, and I'll explain this briefly, I want you to think about one disaster or a couple of disasters in your groups. But other than the pandemic, I don't want you to think about the COVID pandemic, because I need you to think of something that is farther apart from our present, so we all have a better perspective, because the pandemic is still too close to really understand some of the issues around that. So think about that disaster and think about the framing, the causative model, and think about then, once you think about the causative model and how that's framing the media, think about better ways that that constitute the factors that create that disaster, that crisis, right? And finally, think about these final questions, right? So it's an either or sort of like polemic, but see if you can think through that question. Okay,